Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
So. I'm a little bit under the weather. Okay. All right.
If I remember correctly, we did not start talking about this chapter last time.
No, we cut it off a bit. Yeah, chapter 9. Any opening comments or thoughts? Welcome stuff.
No.
I don't think so. We'll just get into it.
It's been a challenging few days for me. I didn't get to go to the We Robot workshop today, and I may have to miss some of the conference tomorrow too. So we'll see. But it's it looks a lot of fun. They went to Boston Dynamics and other things, and it looks like a great situation. So I'm kind of a little FOMO fear of missing out about it, but that's okay.
Better to miss, but to stay home and rest than to go and make yourself feel worse.
Yeah. Interesting. I may have to go. I have to go to a different event that, like, for my job stuff, which is interesting. More about that later. As far as this time, thank you, Amanda, for kind of putting this stuff together, and I think you kind of got stuff down here too. So I'll let you lead off and dive into this how you want to begin.
Sure. Yeah, I put some highlights in the human use of human beings, like annotated bibliography page thing we have going. But I don't really have any substantive thoughts on like anything from this chapter. I was I don't know, because it was like more, it was less philosophical, is more just like, this has been the progression of technology. We had some takes towards the end, but nothing too exciting. And unlike other chapters where I felt like there were some other chapters where I felt like there was nothing too exciting, but there like really could have been. Like he didn't talk about things that I think would have been interesting in the discussion. But here, I didn't even have that feeling. I was just kind of like, okay, that was informative.
Yeah, I feel like in my ultimate version of this book, or like if I was to rewrite it, I would kind of separate out just chapters that are just giving you background and saying what happened versus his like philosophical and technological insights versus his predictions. Because I didn't read every line of this, but I got through most of it, and I looked at the end and kind of saw things. But it felt a little bit like, yeah, I like the quotes you pulled over here. It felt a little bit, it's really interesting to consider because I don't feel like I learned much of anything from this. And I think it's so important to realize that's because I grew up, in the second millennium. Like I a lot of time in the next century at the end of this, and a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, I really I really wonder how much. It's one of those things where I wonder. It's like the interesting um, gap, or I don't know. I think there's some fancy word for it, but I don't recall what it is. It's really easy for me from the vantage point and from the technology I have and the access of it. Like we're looking at this on, a PDF that's, you know, like easily accessible. And I found, granted, I'm in a hotspot for such literature relative to other bookstores, but I was able to find a used book, a used later edition, reprint of this book. Um, and I feel like outside of, I wonder how much celebrity Norbert Weiner really had at the time. I know he was famous. He was this sort of prodigy, and but I really wonder, like, what would it? Well, it's hard for me to really make an equivalent situation of it because I feel like what he's saying is profoundly insightful in most of the book, even if it's not like, accurate or he kind of has loose analogies. But there's a sense of, I really wonder who was around to receive it at the time. Like this feels, like I don't know who will pick up this book and have access to it and really understand it and understand a lot of the different like domains that he's talking about. Like I have a little bit of background in literature. I know about international. I know about international politics and international situation that he's referring to because I studied that in a past sort of life trajectory. I know a little bit about the technology because I looked into that, here and before and other stuff. And I really wonder, like, who in the 50s would have access to this book and really get it. And it's funny because I wonder what an equivalent book would be now too. Like in terms of the closest person that comes to my mind, and he's a bit on the pessimistic side, and I'm always hesitant to reference him, but is kind of is this what his website is now? Is kind of this guy. Like he has a little bit of like a lot of his stuff is on like very cyberpunk, very substrate monopoly, and like, oh, we are inevitably destined into living in like a virtual world and corporate competition or whatever power structures are going to be really heavily competing for controlling the substrates for the worlds we're going to live in as programmatically generated everything becomes more and more and more appealing. And he has a lot of like he has a lot of these essays about like what to do with that. And I don't I don't I don't I don't love everything that he says, and I don't like some of his attitudes, but I feel like he's, like if Michael Levin wrote stuff, I think it'd be really profound. And I've kind of mentioned, um, I don't think I put anything here, but if you saw in the Discord, I've, I put just pull this up. I basically once again cited Levin in this stuff here, which is sort of related to things. Like I think what Levin's getting at in terms of this stuff, all work is being synthesized for a framework for understanding and related, whether by communication or control, no cybernetics. Truly diverse intelligence is a product that has implications for biology, but also development for ethical social frameworks that will be essential in the future as the forms of agents around us diversify far beyond what's currently imaginable. Like, I think if Levin, I looked for him stuff recently, I think if Levin was writing stuff too, I think he, at a material sense, agential materials, and diverse intelligences, I think he has that sort of vantage point. But I also feel like more so than Levin, I don't see, or more so than Magella, I don't see him as, I don't think anybody's really more plugged into all this different stuff than Michael Levin is in that sense. But I think it's a really, I'm looking a little bit into like philosophy of history and history of science, philosophy of science, and stuff like that. And it's a really interesting thing for me to think about when I look at this book, because going back to kind of the main point, it wasn't interesting in a conventional sense to me of the other parts of the book, but I also feel like in 55, 56, and 1960, and I see this book, and I happen to be, here in Boston or something, and oh yeah, Northern Winery's got a book out or something. I really wonder what. Then we can look at find out what a review is at the time, but I really wonder how much people could grasp of it, because I feel like it's so. I don't know. I'll return the mic to you. Let's see. I like this. I like the tool genealogy quote too.
Yeah, I thought it'd be weird if a book on this topic didn't have some kind of history of technology. Didn't have some kind of thing like this chapter, just a brief story about significant developments. And I don't think more commentary would really be necessary. That's kind of what much of the rest of the book has been the commentary on these issues. But I agree that I don't know, it's hard for me to think about who the audience would be. I don't know, probably academics, and probably a diverse set of academics. But I know it was meant as a popular, it's not technical, it's not too dense. Yeah. But I think it's meant for a popular audience in the sense that it's people in different areas of academia who aren't, in his particular area can all get something from.
Yeah, and I think it was really nice to put all this together for that person, because I feel like for that person who maybe has no context, it is really, generating a lot of leads for them to follow, which is cool.
Mm-hmm. I appreciated the history because I don't know, I still learned something.
Yeah. I pulled up another book I'll reference a little bit later, but I don't want to just dive into that. Let's see.
He mentions a type of analog computer on, according to my notes, page 149. The way he describes it, I'm imagining literal cogs. The integration was done by rolling discs engaging one another in a frictional manner. So I thought that was funny. And then, of course, the governor as an example of a machine that uses feedback. I thought it was strange, maybe I'm missing something, but so the title is The First and the Second Industrial Revolutions. And then he, on page 153, says that like the boundary between the two is unclear. It's still too early to say. But then why even kind of like why separate it into two? Like I can see how there's definitely something revolutionary about the developments he described. But like since then, there's like, what's the discrete change that is the second industrial revolution in his account?
Does he say what the second one is explicitly?
I'm not sure. I didn't write it down if he did. So on 153, in its potential significance, the vacuum tube certainly belongs to an industrial revolution different from that of the age of power. So that there's something special about that invention. But
well, I'm getting that he's basically the consequent development of automation both before and after the publication of this first edition of the book has convinced me that I was right in my judgment and development that would be one of the great factors in conditioning the social and technical life, social technical imaginaries of the age to come, the keynote of the second industrial revolution.
okay, so it's automation. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, because there's, I was going to mention, yeah, I guess they were here in the comments, thanks. But cybernetic dreams, basically the song about creating this perfect man is the automatic man, and I feel like it's a fitting 80s take on. I feel like the what's I gonna say? I feel like the it's cybernetics remains to be such an interesting term to me. I know we talk about it all the time, but the way it just sort of went into just such wacky stuff, and then in the 80s became almost like retro cool by taking on the meaning of specifically, oh, it's computer stuff, like it's cyber is computer is automatic is all this other stuff. And then like the famous, I feel like the line, probably the younger generations don't know, but like kind of my generation and my dad, my father's generation, like I'm a cybernetic organism. Like that line from Terminator and what the Terminator represented is like the iconic thing of cybernetics. And if we go a little bit more nerdy or play games, like okay, cybernetics basically means like prosthetics, and like these like enhanced cyborg stuff, and all of this sort of like messy terminology, and it's sort of funny because I feel like this lyric talks directly about that, and it's quite funny in terms of this image of making what it was. And like, is it like, do people call the second industrial revolution about automation? I don't know if it's.
Well, I think it's like sometimes people refer to it as automation, sometimes it's information, but there are a suite of traits that are, or I guess you could say a suite of characteristics that go along with it. So it's some automation, because automation was happening right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, from the very beginning. But you also get this sort of information revolution, and maybe you didn't have the language for it then. Maybe people didn't see that it's actually information that was enabling that. Because you do have, like, by the 50s, you start to get things like, computers, and they didn't really do what they would do later. But, that's clearly where that was going.
Yeah, open hearth furnace. So the first is more, industry and factories, steam engines, and interchangeable parts, mass production. The second was characterized by the build of railroads, large-scale iron steel production, wide scales of machinery, manufacturing, steam power, telegraph, use of petroleum, beginning of electrification, organizational methods for large-scale businesses came to use. And I know this is a little bit of a stretch, but even like there's this is from the Theory and Reality book that I'm diving into, and in the book I don't have a picture of it. Like a few pages before the start of this, they talk about shortly after this time, like the next few pages, you can imagine this is talking about Copernicus, and then into Galileo, and then into Descartes, and that period of the mid 1600s, 17th century. It gets into like the societal, the transition from universities, which were of a scholastic tradition. That's part of what actually, I think I put this in the Discord. Let's see if I can find it easily. Hold on. This sort of tradition going from, I didn't really understand what scholasticism or the scholastic tradition meant. And what it meant was, in sort of the Middle Ages, this Christian and like Greek, Platonic, or Aristotle heavy referencing into the universities, which were these, institutions of knowledge. But you think about like Oxford, and a lot of those universities, or even to an extent Harvard and some things in New England, but Oxford is, all about Christianity. It's all laid in these social institutions that were affecting it. So now, Norbert already mentioned it in the book some time ago, like, now we're like really, it's almost like this is a little bit out of order, but the second industrial revolution and its impact on those industrialization of the research labs that we talked about before. It's kind of, I don't know, coming at it again from this other, other lens, I guess.
So what is that like? So you'd go from scholasticism to universities, and then from universities to something else, and it's basically a shift.
Where's the best way to find this? Universities were scholasticism.
Right, that was, and then they transitioned into something else that wasn't that.
Yeah, there was a slow movement away from, like the book. I can't really say it very easily. I'm trying to find this. Initially, like things like Copernicus and other people in that era were kind of, there's the famous deal about, the person who wrote the foreword to Copernicus's book about the laws of motion was saying, hey, this isn't any commentary on how the heavens work, or how the heavens, what they're doing. This is just a suggestion for prediction, instrumentalism only. We're only talking about a potential way to think about this stuff, and very, I'm not going to touch that. And I think it's just this transition away from that, and then finally you get the I don't really know how to differentiate. Okay. Medieval school of philosophy that employed critical methods, Aristotelian, blah 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 blah. It kind of wow, it had a 600-year run. Yeah, sort of this transition to science. That's kind of where I'm at in the theory and reality book, is like just briefly getting very into differentiating that stage of what was science and what was before science, and how did that whole thing shake out in terms of having the scientists and do the scientific methody kind of stuff,
Right.
and in that whole space. We're probably pretty off track here, so I
Well, no, this is kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I think this is good. So scholasticism, would it have been kind of replaced by like Enlightenment, Age of Enlightenment? Is that
I believe so. And I forget if that's directly after the scientific revolution.
So yeah, high scholasticism was the 13th and early 14th century. And you get universities in the large cities of Europe, and clerical orders were originally the ones that were trying to take control over them, and then yeah, so that time period.
So 17th and 18th, so getting your 1600s here. Newton, yeah, okay. Newton was doing his stuff in later half of the century. Descartes was earlier that century. Masonic lodges, literary salons, coffee houses. The days the layman under the authority of the monarchy and the church. You kind of get these, things. Okay. Interesting. Anyway, I've started some things over here. I appreciate you putting this here about Fuchs, because I'll get back to that later. Oh yeah, natural philosophy and natural history. Let's spin up a few different things, because I'm kind of, one of the things, a little bit of a side note for me, is like I'm kind of trying to trace out, with the help of this book to some extent, I'm trying to trace out sort of how philosophy, I find the term natural philosophy really interesting, and sort of the evolution away from this to science or scientist, and sort of where philosophy has gone in relation to it. And it's weird because I'm understanding a little bit more about, I don't know the best way to show this, but the famous line, footnotes to Plato, and how like Western philosophy and Western thought is kind of a series of that for a long time. And I'm kind of understanding my take on, there was this rigorous sense of lineage philosophically, it was the way to go for a long time. And then it was sort of like, oh, well, I'm trying to understand my personal take on, I don't know what to call it. I guess you could say philosophy, but it's sort of like there is this necessary, hey, macro changing of how some things are done, but also, I don't know, the trajectory of things changed, or like the sense of linking evolved, and I feel like a lot of people have much better thoughts on that than I do, but I'm exploring that space. So, yeah. Oh, thank you for putting all that there. Great. I don't know. I could keep rambling about that, but we should probably continue with this stuff. Automation, the second revolution. Yeah, his white collar automated labor.
Oh yeah, I liked that phrase. That was a good description of like what AI can do. Okay, so I see like the real significant difference between the which was about just mechanical power, like just machines that can do what you have one machine. I think mining was one of his examples, one machine can do work that you would need like 20 people to do. So it's about like horsepower, manpower. But then the second industrial revolution would be about more like intelligent, just work that doesn't require just force, but that requires even just a minimal amount of like decision making,
Yes.
control. Like it can be really minimal, and that is significantly different.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting way to think about it.
It's intelligent in a very watered down sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of I'm glad you kind of I was going to basically reference this part as well.
It's funny that he says, I think on page 159, in the same paragraph as the white collar comment, I cannot see automatic machinery of the judgment replacing type. It's such a funny phrase for what we'd now just call AI. Automatic machinery of the judgment replacing type coming into use in the corner grocery or in the corner garage, although I can very well see it employed by the wholesale grocer and the automobile manufacturer. So is that probably because of the scale? Your wholesale grocer and your manufacturer are just larger scale, so you'd need, like, the payoff would be bigger if you can replace people with a machine. Or is the idea also that like part of the job of the cashier in the corner grocery is like there's an interpersonal, like I can imagine someone writing about this in the 50s thinking that no, that interpersonal interaction that you have with the cashier at the corner grocery, like that can't go. That's never going to be replaced. So maybe there's an aspect of that too.
It's really interesting to think about now with like the advent of the robots, the customer service robots. There's a long-standing, I don't know, I'm not going to be able to find it. There's on a sports show, talk show I listened to, one of their long-standing supporters is a bank. I don't remember which one, but their slogan is the Blah Blah Bank, where we take banking personally. And their thing is, you will not. One of their latest commercial is basically, kind of a throwback to some of this stuff, saying, when computers came out, and they thought they were going to solve all this stuff, and they're like, and they say, hey, yeah, but don't you hate talking to some automated system at, I don't know, First National Bank or something? We always pick up on the first ring, and we'll never, you'll talk to a real person. And so in the sports talk show that I listen to, they make fun of this all the time. They make me like old man sounds, like, and saying like, oh, we'll take things personally, just like First National Bank, or like there'll be this, like that's such an old timer sentiment, right? And so it's just this interesting juxtaposition of, like, there are certainly some automated technology that does exist in, the bodega, or like the store, but it's not. It's kind of limited to, maybe surveillance or some of the accounting or some of the computing or the register, whatever, that stuff. But it's an interesting thing. I've actually thought about this. I don't really have a conclusion or really interesting things to say about it, but this quote, and maybe a little bit this one, but we already discussed it a lot. This quote this is the quote that actually stuck out with me the most when I was breezing through the chapter. Because I don't know, like there's something there's something about this that's really related to, as Norbert points out in immediately following, he gets into the exploitation part of it, and the yeah, you got the quotes here, which is exactly what I was thinking about. Like, there's this model, there's this huge incentive to operate this way. Like, this is the way it's done. This is progress, and I feel like that's sort of the immediate political and like economic aspect of it. And there's also this sort of there's this, I keep thinking of something that I think like Daniel Polanyi and Adam Safran were talking about in one of the EI workshops a while ago, about sort of like being on the edge of the chaos and looking over the edge, or being just outside of the chaotic edge of whatever. And like there's like part of control theory commenting on that. I don't remember what exactly it was, but it was basically saying, you want to be where other things or other agents are dealing with the chaos, and you're kind of outside of that. They know you're much better than I do. I can't remember it, but thinking about that, and not saying they say what I'm about to say, but it's sort of this sense of it's sort of the difference between Norbert Weiner could have probably used a lot of his insight to just put himself into a series of these situations and make a lot of money off of, and I'm not praising Norbert for being, not into money, but more like, I feel like there's such a and almost a sociological level, an anthropological level, at a macro societal level. There's sort of this, do you, and at a really high level, I kind of get at a really high, benevolent, flattering level, I get this is kind of what OpenAI was trying to do, in the sense of, let's do this thing and then talk about it a lot and show people it at a light, accessible level so they can get it and put their Overton window, put it in the zeitgeist. Like, I get that. I don't know I agree with a lot of this or that about it, but I get that, because I feel like Norbert's trying to do that somewhat with the book, as opposed to just not telling anybody about this and saying, yeah, here's what it is, here's what's happening, call this domains. I'm gonna cash out, and I'm not gonna tell anybody about it, and say, or I could, make a lot of literature that says, oh yeah, like the merits of binding, and this is how we do this, that, and the thing. And this also reminds me a little bit like all the weird stuff. I have such weird feelings about like the Rust Belt and the old coal mining places, and the older the places that were previously really industrious in certain ways, or like auto. I kind of feel like it's funny, because I think of like Detroit, and now I've mentioned you're there, and I'm sure you can say more about it, what it's like there than I can. But just these sort of weird, this weird tension between talking about stuff, the relative effectiveness or use of talking about stuff, and then what's actually happening. I don't know. My point has become deleted somehow, but I'll try to recover it a bit later, I think.
I think I see what you mean. Like, there's only so much you can predict. There's only so much you can just like philosophize about before it's happened.
Well, yeah, but
so like maybe this is what you meant by the OpenAI. Like, if you just bring more into, if you just like actualize more, then there's more to react to, and then there's more to like inform maybe policy making. But if you're trying to do the policy making before things exist, then there's like always going to be something you can't predict.
Yeah, and even kind of going back to my opening bit about book and like who's reading this book at the time and what can they make from it. It's sort of, I think on a really personal, subjective note, there's things that I want to do that are like writing books like this, and I'm wrestling about the use of it so much because I don't really want to just. Is it sort of going to? If I make a book, well, I'm not going to make a book, but if I do a project like a longer term project of mine, will it ultimately be something that's just like only really is graspable and useful in a retrospective sense? And it's like, oh yeah, that explains time well, and it may not be something people fully understood then, but it historically it's like a nice landmark that has justification and explains some things. That's kind of what I'm wrestling with as I think about this in the background. But yes, in a more direct sense, the OpenAI thing is basically what you said, and kind of, you know, the tension between do you in cybernetics and Norbert terms, like, is there any I think you guys might remember this. I think Bradley might remember this, but I'm not going to pull it up. In the original cybernetics book, somewhere Norbert talks about anti-homeostatic things and talks about like propaganda and news media and like people putting out information or content or ideas that are, you know, not well sorted out, or like disinformation, misinformation, and confusing stuff, and saying, oh, that was really dysregulatory, it's anti-homeostatic. And I feel like, okay, are books like this, instead of looking the other way and not talking about, you know, what's going on behind the curtain, and just saying, oh well, the thing to do, or like the American philosophy of progress, as he's calling it here, kind of, you know, rightfully or wrongfully kind of dragging it, juxtaposing the difference between, you know, well, that's business as usual, just make your money and get out, versus trying to explain what's going on, and then versus sort of, you know, open source, OpenAI, and this, no, we're going to introduce this big thing to the public right now, and we're going to deal with it now, and we're going to wreck some industries now. We're going to, you know, we're just going to release this now. Like this sort of, is that actually homeostatic? Is that helping regulation? Is it, I guess the sort of counterpoint is also things like, oops, sorry. Like there's like people who are various forms of accelerationists from like the Marxist stuff, or just people who really want the technological singularity to come, like tech accelerationists, and all of those stuff too. Sort of that's wading out into stuff I don't really want to delve deeply into, but it's there, and it's just like, I don't know.
You mean that when people pursue strategies for sort of doing something like innovation, or that can be homeostatic or anti-homeostatic. So, for example, disrupting an industry is anti-homeostatic in the sense that it's disrupting an industry, and maybe it's doing things in a non-necessary way. If we, say, for example, took a different strategy of, like, you know, reflecting on, you know, what the role of technological change was on certain industries or certain social relationships, we would make different decisions. I mean, because, you know, sometimes one of my criticisms of this idea of anti-homeostasis is that it's just kind of like, you know, vibes. Like it's vibes and anti-vibes. It's like whatever is good is homeostatic and whatever I think is bad is anti-homeostatic. And it's like these forces that don't exist, that they're kind of like, and so like you have to kind of put this a little bit in a little bit more concrete terms. When you say homeostatic versus anti-homeostatic, do you mean change, disruption, unnecessary change, or is there some speed that we can some way in terms of like the speed of change we can characterize anti-homeostasis, or is there something about like putting a lot of information between us and the effects of something? Is that homeostatic? So in other words, if we know if we guide innovation in ways that are good for society instead of bad, if we can do that, I don't know if we can. Yeah, then that's homeostatic, and I think that's where Weiner is trying to go with that. Although it does tend to run into that problem of it's either homeostatic or anti-homeostatic, and you have two people with wands and they're like kind of making noises and pretending that they're having an effect on things when it's just kind of like divining things that are good versus bad, and there's nothing there that's there's no control, as it were, sort of illusory. I see you pulled up Gary Marcus. We haven't talked about him in a while.
Well, I haven't, I think we all understand Gary Marcus's views, and I'm not going to rehash them. I just mentioned this because he's kind of referencing the pause letter here, and I guess he's recapping by saying these things too. I didn't read all this article. I just saw a little bit of it, and we do have more attention. It's this hasn't changed, I guess.
Right.
He regrets signing a letter. Never going to have a moratorium. I agree with it. I appreciate and mostly agree with what Bradley just said about. It's not like there's nobody. There's one of my favorite lines in a very old song that Led Zeppelin remade. That when the levee breaks, is a song people may know, but it's basically saying crying won't help you, praying won't do you no good. Is when the levee breaks, mama, you got to move. And it's basically like there's an element of you can feel what you want to feel about the rapidity of things, but you can't do much about it, right? Like you can't.
Yeah.
And I have sympathy for that because it's like you have to be realistic about what's actually happening.
Right.
And I feel like kind of what I hear in Norbert's voice at the time is sort of a bit like like I've become death sort of stuff. Like he's realizing, okay, like we're losing it. Like we're not. I imagine he's kind of seeing like we're crossing the Rubicon of we're automating the stuff, and we're putting, to go back to his take on the second industrial revolution, we're putting automation into this stuff. We are officially like the decision making is being limited. It's not really what I want to say, but.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good example of kind of this, where you have this idea of a pause in AI. So you pause for 6 months, and then what? If you don't have any information to really make good decisions, then that pause is just 6 months where you don't do anything, and then the same things happen 6 months from now. So it's not so much that things need to pause, it's just that they need to figure out. But of course, there's no guarantee that they'll figure out what's going on. Whereas, like what you're saying with the levee reference is that, maybe we can't respond to it. Maybe it's just something that's going to happen. And it's like we can maybe mitigate it, but it's not something that we can like really plan around and really, we can't plan to avoid it. It's kind of like it's going to happen. We can maybe, regulate things, but it's, we could spend 6 months just doing nothing and sitting in our hands, and then the same effects would come to 6 months later. And so you have to make sure that you have the information before you actually do the work, I guess.
I feel like what it puts pressure on, and I feel like one of the starkest contrasts that is in the zeitgeist of right now, 2023, like today, and Norbert. I feel like Norbert kind of had a exasperation, and I don't want to say clutching of pearls because that phrase always bothers me, and I don't really even know what it means. But just like Norbert, I feel is like having a kind of moral alertness about this, and I think he's feeling. I feel him saying a lot of, and this is my take on it. I feel him saying he's seeing the decoupling of some things happening. He's seeing the speed. He's seeing where things are going to go, and he's like has a certain moral. Oh, I better sort of show a sort of outrage to it, and I feel like now, especially kind of with Gen Z, even I would say, in how they deal with some things and whatnot. But even like me as the millennial generation, it's sort of the moral alarm is different, and we kind of have a century of realizing, yep, it's gonna keep going unless, and this is the big thing. I don't know how to say this, but you probably get what I mean. There's sort of the big unless, which has been made into World War III, made into global pandemic, made into well, you better know your kind of weird, crazy uncle who lives off by himself and has a bunch of gun in storage because you're going to go live with him. It's sort of like all of these variations of the catastrophic thing, and like either the big revolution, like the Marxist revolution, or just the global system collapse. Like you kind of have this like, like a lot of there's sort of the jadedness and the apathy. And I feel like Norbert is writing in a period where it's easier to be naive about that in a way. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do. I think, I think it comes down to like, I have a whole bunch of different feelings about all this stuff, in the sense of there's just the realism thing. You're going to do what you got to do, and blah, blah, blah. We're not going to have any chance. I'm sympathetic to the We Robot crowd of people on like the ultimate front line of this problem, trying to tentatively put together something that's going to link the present moment and its vast inadequacy with something more tenable or more like connected to what things are going. That's kind of an inherently impossible task, And then there's sort of the radical side is like, yeah, well, a lot of those things should change. A lot of the systems should fall apart anyway, and that's what we need to do. And I think you can kind of pick whatever dealer's choice about what way you want to approach that. But anyway,
there's a sort of a tendency to view things in terms of catastrophism. Like, if you're viewing cultural change that's going to happen in the future, I mean, there are different models that we use. Like, there's like optimism, and there's also catastrophism, and not necessarily based on any information, but just kind of a general tendency. And so I think that's been very predominant in some of the views of the future as well. And I think that's, always something that you have because you simply don't have that information to say, I can predict what's going to happen 10 or 15 years from now. I mean, I have some, but not enough. And so I can use the mental model of some type of perspective to sort of interpret it, and people do this again and again, and it's kind of like, it's like when people sometimes when religious cults predict the end of the world, and they predict it for a very specific date, or they pick it for a very specific year, but it never happens, of course. And so it's almost always the same kind of script, but it never happens. And so they always use the same reasons that can keep coming up again and again. And so it's not for nothing that we have that same argument even in like technological spheres. It's just I don't know.
And we're pretty much out of time, but I'll reference. You guys may not remember Logan, but Logan Thrasher Collins is someone I met in Vision, and he does stuff for like bio and like biomodeling and stuff, and he's really sensitive to the idea that he's very sensitive to the future being critiqued or being like all like Black Mirror negative dystopian stuff.
Right.
And so he's almost I deeply respect and enjoy Logan's perspective. I think he takes any judgments about that in a very harsh way, a little not too harsh, but I have sympathy for him in the sense of I do think it's quite an interesting phenomenon that I kind of said like the 80s and the end of the glorious future, sort of like there was this big, I wasn't really around for it, but I put it together like when the Cold War ended, that was kind of one of the branches of like, oh right, like with the Cold War's over, economy boom, bubble, all the .com stuff and the internet, and then it just, you dive back into 9/11 and the recessions and stuff like that, and I feel like there's been a huge a lot of the references to the future, like if you talk about the future in an optimistic way, it's really out of vogue right now. And it's kind of hard to counter that.
Well, and when people do talk optimistically, it's always like, well, after, the catastrophe.
yeah.
Right. Or like, this is like one of the most Boston things I can possibly say. Literally walking back before this meeting started, I saw this gentleman. There's a bunch of conferences happening right now. I think there's one for like longevity or something. Or there's a group of longevity people, and I saw the back of this. It was an older gentleman too, so it was quite interesting. And he said, "Life is short." It's like something. Life is short until you extend it. And there was just this like really interesting like. I didn't talk to him, so I'm totally superficial. But the jacket had this exuded this sort of we're like, hey man, like we're gonna live forever, like right now we're almost there. So like there's a whole class of like the effective altruist super long termist people who I even think of like just to put this on the record, I feel like this has come up a bunch of times in different people, the Slave Star Codex, Meditations on Moloch stuff, and the big conclusion at the end of it is like, well, we're going to take death away, like we're just going to take it off the picture, and that's going to be part of how we're going to stop the trading. Moloch is a reference here for like people undercutting, selling out the future, and playing some dirty games, but it's kind of this weird. Like. I really appreciate some of it, and I really admire this, but also sort of the ending is a little bit of like, as long as the offer is open, it'll be irresistible. So we need to close the offer. And only another god can kill Moloch. We have one on our side, but he needs help. We should give it to him. And I basically feel like it's saying, it's been like reinterpreted or taken as like, well, we just have to get over biological death and then we'll be fine because that will take away all the pressures in the world. And I feel like that's cool. So anyway, we're quite over. So interesting discussion as always. I think we've hit the chapter here. Next time it looks like we'll be the Twitter chapter.
Oh yeah.
The chapter 10. Any other thoughts or ideas for next time?
I look forward to it.
I
Have you
appreciate
guys watched Mr. Robot
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
TV show?
Yeah.
I've seen some of it. That's
Thank
the
you.
one with like the guy. Yeah, okay. What about it?
It just some of the major themes are things that we talked about today. It's also
watched
just
it.
really good TV.
I never finished it. I'm still enjoying Cyberpunk. So to be discussed next time.
Yeah.
I'll let you guys go for now.
Great.
Fun times as always, and take care.
Okay.
Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.